Hopefully you enjoyed that. Now we're going to be joined by a fabulous panel talking about cross-media measurement, but more on a measurement framework point of view and how marketers can really, in amongst a changing market, keep some clarity on their own goals and how they're looking at activity. So welcome to Angelina, Imran and Paul. I'll stop sharing and let's get chatting.
Hello there.
Hey.
Hello from New York.
Yeah, thanks for staying up, Angelina.
Not a problem.
All right, let's crack into it. So I guess the framing of this is quite obvious for most people on the call. We've got a challenged economy globally. We've got constant changes in media consumption, whether that be shifting within digital, extra digital sort of digitization of other channels. We've got huge changes for the industry in terms of browser tech, privacy, identifiers. So everything's up for grabs, right? I'm going to get you all just to give a top level, I guess, framing and a bit of advice for marketers. So while all this is changing, how on earth can marketers create, I guess, frameworks or systems that allow these different types of activities as they change, not to completely overwhelm them and allow them to keep assessing clearly what's going on in their own activity? Paul, let's kick off with you.
Sure. Okay. Well, my experience and expertise is more, looking at the impact on sales and looking at the impact on brand. I'll focus on sales firstly, and apologies, this is probably going to be pretty verbose, but I know, with a lot of the changes, people are now saying, can you measure the impact on sales? The answer is yeah, you still can entirely. It's just that you need to move from a deterministic model to a probabilistic approach. So what I mean there is, rather than having the long customer journey, being able to see every activity that somebody's done on their online journey, and then, let's be honest, assigning all of the value to the last thing that they do in most cases. It's instead now looking at the probability of things. So rather than looking at the individual, looking at segments, looking at cohorts, looking at groups of customers and saying, what's the probability of an activity impacting them and getting them to change? It's more accurate. It can still be a live dynamic thing based into a system. It can still be live and learning. It can still be evolving and growing. But it means that you can do it without needing it at that identity level because it's probabilities. It can bring in absolutely anything. So there's a lot of people doing it. The other advantage is cross-platform, true cross-platform measurement isn't as important for measurement. Now, it's still very important for, knowing things like, say, your incremental reach and that sort of activity, but to know what's happened, it's less important because, even when we were looking for Nirvana, we were really matching TV and digital, right? We were ignoring out-of-home, press, radio, all of those other things. And I don't have many clients that only use TV and digital. So it was having to be stitched together anyway. Now all we're saying is you have to stitch together other data as well. It's not a new process. To be honest, it's been around since the 50s. It's just a case of doing it with a bigger data set and bringing people back to it. So it might mean a little bit of investment. It might mean a little bit of upskilling for people, but it's definitely possible. So, that's my first move from deterministic to probabilistic. The second is having a solution that relies on identity is going to be a lot harder going forwards. You can definitely still activate at a identity level. If you've got an identity partner, you want to create audiences, you definitely still can using that segment data. If you've got authenticated traffic data from LiveRank or something like that, you can use it. But relying on that as your measurement framework is going to be tricky because there's a lot of partners who still won't play in that space. First party data are really important, but if you're relying on data on people that you have an interaction with, you're not growing your penetration. And I think as marketers, we need to focus on growth. So whilst it can be part of it, I don't think that you want a solution that's reliant on it to be able to be future proof. So that's my second kind of tip is segment or groups of customers rather than at an identity level. I think everything can kind of help, but just don't be reliant on it.
Fantastic. I was expecting you to go on, Paul. I guess you.
My reputation precedes me.
Angelina, what are your thoughts on how marketers can handle all of this?
You called on me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So there's two things actually, and that's really being involved. We have several companies, especially trade organizations, that are really trying to answer a lot of these questions and solve some of the fragmentation that we have in the marketplace. So if you think about, I'm just going to promote the IAB Tech Lab. A lot of the things that we work on is based off of member input and participation. And in order for us to develop some of the measurement requirements or measurement needs of a buyer and a marketer, we need tech specs in order to figure out how to deliver those types of metrics and measuring dimensions. So I really encourage companies to be involved with your local trade organization, be it IAB or with a tech lab or with WFA or any of those organizations, and really give your recommendations on what you'd like to see, the methodologies behind them, and where that information should be sourced. The second thing I think is really important is that, as you had mentioned earlier in your opening, there's a lot of changes happening in the marketplace, especially given the loss of identifiers and the loss of cookies. And it's going to be that much harder, going to be very difficult for a lot of companies to actually collect data and create attribution models off of it, let alone multi-touch attribution modeling off of it. And so, again, encourage you to really participate in any organization to voice and provide use case studies, exactly how your organization is structured, the financial impact that this will have to your revenue, to your bottom line, the amount of investments that you'll need to actually accommodate all these changes. So we have, example is the Partnership for Responsible Addressable Media, which is a worldwide consortium of various different organizations, from marketers to tech to publishers, really getting together and really starting to document and outline what are the business use cases and what are those logistical and technical needs in order to enable us to do the work that we're thinking that we want to continue with, which includes remarketing, retargeting, lift measurement, A/B split testing, creative sequencing, audience segmentations, and things of that sort. We're going to be in quite a challenge in trying to figure out the difference between data coming from Safari versus coming from Chrome, and then everything else, right? So we have more walled gardens, have a lot of different data points that are fragmented and inconsistent. A really good example is if you're a marketer and you have a video campaign, I'm sure you're running that video on your website, in your own social handle, as well as paid social, display media, video campaign, television, and so forth. And just trying to collect video data across all those platforms and align them and compare them to one another is quite difficult. I came from Morgan Stanley, where I was running analytics, and we had a very heavy, or they still do have a very heavy video campaign where they are developing lots of different videos for all across all different channels. And my job was to aggregate how many video plays, video completions, likes, shares, and so forth. And it was very, very challenging.
That would have prepared you well for agency world, having to do that again in a broader sense. Yeah, fantastic. Imran, DoubleVerify obviously have been working with, I guess, buy and sell side, looking at media quality and how that feeds into impact. How are you seeing all these changes feeding up into the measurement framework for marketers?
Well, so for DV, I think like we work directly with a lot of major global brands as well. And like, so our advice probably when we're speaking to big brands is there's probably two parts around research, which is like look for guidance from the bodies like the IAB. Obviously, the IAB have set out frameworks in Europe and in other regions as well. But that's like, as Angela said, it's the coming together of all of the partners that are within the IAB. So you're looking at multiple different businesses within the industry, bringing together their expertise to help build that framework as a whole. I think a number of brands as well are working with their agencies, and those agencies themselves as well, they've been spending years trying to understand how to develop a framework for their 100, 200 different brands to ensure there is a consistent consistency in measurement across their businesses as alone, right? So I think definitely working with the industry, with your agency partners, etc. But then that will putting that research in and will allow you then as a business to probably, I think, create a common language or some sort of currency that you can define that is successful for your business, right? And then you can, once you can define that currency or that language that delivers some sort of an outcome for your business, that's how you then work with your partners to deliver that. And so you kind of get to the next phase, which is more about like how you align with your media with your brand and your sales objectives. And that kind of can kind of probably seem a little bit simple in terms of, well, we need to sell more product, we need to build our customer base, and we need growth. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't work like that when you go through the different stages. And if you think about it from, like, when we're talking about media optimization, if we think that an ad, for example, or something like that may be deemed non-brand safe, just as an example for their business, or not necessarily suitable. There probably are other indicators across that impression that can be measured now, that are within your framework that can define that it's actually still going to drive value for your business and an outcome that you may require. For example, it may sit on a cusp of what deems brand safe or not for your business. However, the viewability might be there, or it's definitely gone to a human. So when you take in different data inputs and you can assess them, once you've built out your framework, you can then decipher on actually that quality of that media and how that delivers performance. But ultimately, you need to build that framework out with your partners and define your own currency.
I'm going to come back to you on that, because that's really interesting, and the devil's in the detail on how to do that with all those complicated details. So, but
I think it is actually a really interesting point, Gai, that one thing that I worry about people going into these frameworks, and definitely some of the discussion that's happened now, is that we go too black and white. So like when viewability comes into it, or whether how long a video is being viewed for, all of these sorts of metrics, and I hear people kind of going, oh, it should be completed view, or it should be 100%. I think, definitely, a video that's been viewed right to the end is going to have more impact than one that's like not viewed or only for 3 seconds. But there's the danger in saying absolutely zero impact. I think, it means that people are going to miss the opportunity to make sure that the frame that's sitting there on the screen before it's run is, has your distinctive assets and is well curated, because that can work as a banner ad on its own. Less value, definitely, but how much less? Because you want to be buying your media by knowing how much more or less sales. There's not one thing that goes, yes, this gives you all the sales and this gives you none of the sales. It's understanding that variability, which is why I think it's always important to try and link all of those metrics back to a sales or a conversion or to something as your metric, so you can understand how much. Because I think, sometimes we get too binary without realizing the value is actually in the gray.
And I think another thing to your point, though, is that we need to consider the creative element in this whole equation. And doesn't matter if you have a really good engaging video, if your branding isn't until the last frame, right? So if it's unclear on what your product or your services are until later in the video, or even just in a banner ad, you can't expect that your brand awareness or the brand impact is a lot higher than if it was something that was persistent throughout the ad.
Yeah, totally agree. We've been trying to get that message through for about 20 years now. So I think the skippable part of videos definitely brought that to light even more.
Well, even with the display banner, right? If you think about a skyscraper unit that is above the fold, if your logo and your call to action is below the fold, you're less likely to have a higher brand recall or even a higher click-through rate. So I've worked on the agency side for about 22 years, and the first thing we found was that animated GIFs were a lot more, had higher response rates because they were typically static. And the brand and the call to action was always prominent.
Paul, long-term brand effect. I know you guys have definitely, you know, you look at the short term, but you also feed in what's happening long term. With all the changes in market, and long term needs a pretty big look back window to work out what's gone on a year or two ago.
Yep.
Are we getting better, or are these changes an opportunity for us to get better at that sort of understanding the long-term brand effect in a quicker way, which I know sounds like an oxymoron, but
I think there's two really interesting dynamics at play here. One, I think that we're getting better at understanding what brand metrics would work. So I think that, you know, if you're looking at something that's mid-funnel and you're trying to move a mid-funnel brand metric, you know, ideally it's like, say, brand equity, but maybe it's consideration or something like that, then you're going to be driving a long-term ROI impact. I'm almost 90% sure on that now. Anything that's too close to funnel, you know, like I would recommend, I'm likely to buy, it's too correlated with the sale. It's not giving you that impact. Something that is at an awareness level, it's too high, the movements aren't meaningful. But that mid-funnel level, if you are tracking that as part of your activity and you see a movement in that, then you're definitely adding to long-term value, long-term ROI for that client. How much? You know, that's a question that you need modeling for, and, you know, you need to kind of go back, but you will definitely be moving it in the right direction as you do that push. The other thing that's come up though, so, you know, like you've got that, not everybody has brand tracking, and some people, you know, they have brand tracking once every 6 months, or they have, you know, like just dips or anything like that. You know, controversial, but share a search. It's out there now. I think a lot of people are kind of looking at it as an input measure, but actually I think it's the output. It's the looking at it as a measure of saliency. So as your share of organic search relative to your category, and this is where the key is making sure that competitive set is defined correctly. It's the key to it. It is predicting longer term movements. So if you're moving that, you're also, I think, likely to be moving your long-term ROI. There's, you know, keys to it. As people start gaming it, it might fall down, but I think that's the fastest one, because as well, then you've got daily levels and you've got like a count that is going to be greater than any brand tracker. So I think they're the two opportunities to be able to get faster. But, you know, share search, an evolving thing, definitely moving those mid-funnel brand metrics, you know, hand on heart, you'll be, you know, if we then ran a model on it, we'd say, yep, you've increased long-term brand ROI.
Yeah, I mean, I'm enjoying the debate around share of search that's going on in market at the moment. The one thing I do like about it is it's accessible for a broader range of brands.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
That's quite exciting. Comparable metrics has been a term that's been floated around for a long time, and there's pros and cons for that. And I guess that goes hand in hand with transparency as well. Angelina, in terms of, I guess, the industry driving some sort of understanding of what people are looking at, whether that be data transparency, whether that be how different metrics compare. I know you're involved in a lot of projects with Tech Lab and the main part of the IAB. What's really moving the industry forward, or what are the opportunities there to really help marketers get that understanding of what the actual playing field is?
So right now in the US side, I have a working group that's really focused on what we'll call developing some datascapes and really helping to identify and map what types of data is available and desired out of different perspectives. So looking at it from a channel perspective as well as a device, and then figuring out how those different types of datascapes actually can interconnect or intersect with one another, and identify some of the gaps and challenges that we have. So even with let's just say a display campaign, your data would look very different between a desktop, a CTV, or a gaming system versus a mobile device. So being able to understand, especially from an attribution standpoint, what you can and can't report and ascertain from the system. So we're working really closely in trying to map out what does the data flow look like, what data is currently being collected, and how can we synergize some of the taxonomies and the nomenclature around these. You know, even I think a good example that I've seen is even within the Google advertising marketing platform between DV360, DCM, and double-click search. If you try to look at all the headers of each of the data dimensions, you kind of scratch your head and figure out like which ones actually align, because how do I actually then compare? So that I think that's an aspect where educating companies on what those are, and then having companies like platforms then decipher and say, okay, our metric or our reporting field for this equals this standard that is being developed or that has been established by any of the accreditation companies that we have.
I guess that's the trick, right? And Imran, you might have a point of view on this. So we're getting, I think the industry's finally heard the call for transparency and a better understanding of what's going on under the hood. But that's complicated, right? So we want greater transparency, empower advertisers to make informed decisions. But there's a lot of detail there. You've got marketers who are increasingly challenged for time, wanting to try new different formats and different platforms. How can marketers get that balance right? You work with a lot of direct clients. Are they investing the time and energy needed for that, or is it just sending them bonkers?
I think I think in a lot of the clients that we work directly with is because they've got a plan in place in terms of how they want to I suppose optimize the final point of that cycle, which is engagement with the consumer. So I think Angela, I think you mentioned earlier on around, creative is incredibly important. And Paul, if you think about the planning cycle, it's like understand customers and advertisers and agencies are trying to understand that consumer, their behaviors and what drives influence, and to build out those media strategies. Okay, how are we going to engage those consumers? What's the creative message going to be, et cetera, and what channels are we going to buy across? When we talk about kind of transparency in measurement of digital advertising, for me, I think that's like the very end point of optimization. So it's great knowing that what your demographic is. It's great spending millions of dollars on these wonderful creative assets. But when you get to the final point and you maybe are optimizing purely to a data signal that's telling you that impression is going to be viewable, that is that point where you win or you lose that potential transaction with the customer. And for us, the way we look at quality is I think, and the IAB will have it as well, is that there's kind of 4 pillars of quality that we can measure in the industry, and that's around fraudulent activity. It's measuring if a brand is in a safe environment based on the criteria and the segments that are in the market that are available. Is it viewable, which has actually been probably one of the major drivers for assumption of media quality for the last number of years. And then something that's actually can be discounted as geography, right? Unless you're doing hyper targeting in a city or something like that, you never really consider the geography. But actually, because of fraudulent activity and because of different things going on, sometimes an ad might not even appear in Australia, right? So the important thing for us is, I think for an industry, if you want to look at quality and you want to bring these 4 pillars together, is understanding the variance between them and the importance against each of those kind of key pillars. And for us as a business, when we work with our customers, what we launched in the market, 4 or 5 years ago, without trying to plug it too much, is the ability to deduplicate that impression, right? And it's an accredited currency or single currency where you can look at a single impression and see if it is fraud free, if it is viewable, or if it's brand safe in the right geography. That ultimately can define quality as a whole at that endpoint of when you're deciding to buy that impression or not. It might be the right publisher. It could be really high quality publisher. However, there could be brand safety issues or brand suitability challenges, for example, what we're seeing right now around COVID and news, right? It might be a viewable impression, but it might not be suitable for your brand right now. Or conversely, it may be positive news about COVID and potentially the economy or cures or community support, etc., that would be suitable for your brand and it's viewable, but you may have put a blanket ban down across COVID news. So I think there's definitely nuances into how you define the quality of a specific impression. I think definitely being able to see or deduplicate that impression across the 4 pillars of quality that the industry has defined is important. But you know, there's assumptions and there's research to be done, but then there's also AI and technology that has to make those decisions for us in real time, because there's just so much data to be processing through a single impression, and the AI is allowing us to build those assumptions or laws of probability on if that is the right and the highest quality impression or inventory for you to purchase. So kind of that's how we kind of see it really.
And on the viewability angle, which you're right, like I don't think we talked about anything else 3 years ago, and it seems to be a little less. But one part of that, the time spent seems to be, you know, bubbling up in terms of importance through a whole lot of different research. Are you seeing that time part of the viewability rather than the percentage of pixels on screen becoming more of a factor?
Well, definitely in the CTV space.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I think with the growth in CTV, you're now able to measure the quartile of an ad. So what sections of the ads actually played. And I suppose when you think about investment of advertising dollars, like the industry is not growing, right? Like total investment in the industry is growing in a very, very tiny fraction. But what we're seeing is shifts in investment from different channels, like so from TV or non-digital channels into digital. And the growth that we're seeing is very much since the COVID pandemic has been around social. And I think social consumer engagement with social is up something like 47%, and with CTV it's up 44% since COVID, right? So consumers are flocking to those 2 areas, and dollars are moving into those areas. So measurement's really important. One thing that an advertiser wants to be able to measure if they're going to start buying high premium CPMs in CTV is the fact, is it viewable? What parts of your video, your 30-second or your 15-second is viewable? So we're seeing in CTV definitely the measurement around specific quartiles of an ad. And that then, I think back to Angelina's point earlier on was, where is your key point in that ad? Is it up at the front? Are the first 5 seconds of that video content actually what needs to be said, as opposed to building that long story with the kicker at the end? And with that insight into how consumers are engaging with ads, be it on CTV, etc., being able to measure by quartile allows brands to then understand how to repurpose creative for the set channel.
I'd like to make,
isn't it? Because isn't it a problem if you go with just high quality? It depends what your objective is, right? So if you're trying to go for engagement, you're trying to launch something, obviously the viewability is really important because they need to go all the way through it. If all you're trying to do is nudge people and remind people, then you need less. I think that's kind of the danger, I think, with people going just quality. I mean, you know, if we were to turn this to TV, it'd be, I need all of my TV advertising in peak, you know, in prime time. Whereas the reality is we know you need some in prime time, but it's never going to be the highest ROI for you. It's never going to be the thing that does the most. So I think it's like, you know, having that one approach. I think you need the nuance depending upon what the objective is. Sure, if it's engagement, if it's a launch, 100%, but then understanding what's the trade-off from premium. Because generally when we're running these models, the most expensive thing is not the thing with the highest ROI.
Yeah, I was going to add, so in order to get these measurements, in order to understand this data, we need companies to push publishers, brands to push publishers to adopt new standards. And, you know, I don't have specifics, but a good majority of publishers still on VAST 2.0. And in order for us to get better measurement with Open Measurement SDK, with and so forth, providing transparency for both the publisher and for the buyer, we should be encouraging publishers to start shifting to VAST 3.0 and above. So I think it's important that that the entire community understands and educate themselves on what are the tech standards out there, so that we can then move towards a more holistic approach in terms of what we can and can't measure. I know that with companies like DoubleVerify, whenever, if you want to measure all the creative itself using the universal ad ID or understanding content classification and genre and all that stuff, you actually need that VAST 4.0 in order to pass through with that high resolution video asset.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. We've got a very strong call to action in the market to upgrade standards at the moment. So I think all three of you, even though there's some disagreement there, are saying the same thing. We need to know what that quality looks like. Paul will then tell us if, you know, what the trade-offs and financially are going to make the thing, and Angelina definitely from those building blocks that we need to have in place to allow all this to happen. Before we wrap up, I'd love each of you to give a sentence or two, and Paul, I'm looking at you, and I'm meaning a sentence or two, on, I guess, the one change that's happening in the market at the moment that you see as the most positive impact, particularly as the market hopefully bounces back buoyantly in 2021. What are you, I guess, most excited about in terms of change? Angelina, let's start with you.
I'm actually hearing from both publisher and marketers, and even the intermediaries in between, really being conscious of consumer privacy. And there's a lot of conversation out there in the marketplace. And one of the interesting pointers from a particular brand that I overheard was, do we actually have too much data, too much content? Should we actually take a step back and figure out a framework in which we are more self-conscious about how we're using data and collecting it? So just because we have it doesn't mean we should use it.
You could also put creative in play there, that consumer experience piece as well as privacy. Yeah, cool. Imran.
Well, for 2021, it'd be amazing if we actually got a vaccine, which would be amazing. I think that would just,
okay, we'll order that. Yep.
That would just everything, right? I mean, like, it would kickstart the economy, it help the market, it bring consumer confidence up again. But really, I think for me, what I'm excited about and what we're excited about is when we see growth, consumer engagement in media and growing in certain areas of the business, and investment coming into these spaces like CTV and new social networks that are growing faster than was expected at the start of the year. I think it goes back to the original question at the very start, Gai, which was, how do we build a framework to allow brands to be confident and comfortable on how and where they invest? And that's around, as these social platforms that are growing because consumer engagement is there and because CTV is growing in all markets, how do we ensure that there is transparency into those growing media? Because I think over the years, we'll all have had that experience where areas such as, programmatic for 4 years was like growing, but then people were talking about it being a black box, but then there's independent measurement in those spaces, and you see the growth of that over time, but it had a stalling period because of that level of transparency. I think if we look at the areas that are growing over the next 6 months or have been growing, and we can offer that level of transparency at the start, it will create confidence in the marketplace, in advertisers to continue to invest in those areas, because ultimately that's where consumers are going. And for me, that's what's really a positive. And the work that we're doing with the IAB globally and locally as well, to try and deploy on the SDK to build out the standards, and should allow advertisers to continue to invest in those growing areas.
Yeah, I'm excited to see, sort of, as programmatic digital out of home and audio as well, we can get it better from the start. Yeah. Paul, what are you excited about?
The thing that I'm most excited about for the digital community is people starting to take it a little bit more seriously in terms of experimenting. So the wider marketing community are no longer saying, oh, I can just put my TVC online, right? That's probably the number one thing. People experimenting with creative, experimenting with new techniques, realizing that you need a different brief to get a good 6-second and a long form than what you do from your TVC. Starting to really dig into it, because I think that means they'll start taking a look at the data signals that are there. They'll start taking a look at the measurement that they have. And I think it's that broader community that are going to help push a lot of this through. But I think, after a long time, we're finally getting people to realize, yeah, it is actually quite different. It's only taken, what, 20, 30 years, but it's exciting to see, I think, now.
We'll mix things up again next year. That's one thing you can be assured of. Thank you all for your time. Angelina, you can clock off and have a cocktail now and relax. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, all of you, welcome. No judging here.
Coffee at my place.
Thank you all for your time this morning.
Nice, thank you very much.